Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. I am Elliot Williams. I'm a principal at the Raven Group, and based in Washington, and a regular commentator on CNN as a legal analyst there. So you're joining us today for our latest virtual presentation. Virtual because, of course, these times aren't normal, and we're all doing our best to keep talking about and raising the issues that are most important to us. Most importantly, far more than to some extent anything we could talk about at one of these events or anything, is stay safe, stay sane, stay home, wash your hands, to be glib. But we will all get through this. It might take a while, but we will get through this. We will get through this together. But thank you again for joining us. Now, of course, you're not here to see me. You are here to see our very, very special guest. And we can bring her in a moment. So Diane Rehm, as you know, if you're tuning into this, hosted the Diane Rehm Show, distributed by NPR, from 1979 to 2016, where it had a listening audience of nearly 3 million people. She now hosts a podcast for WAMU, our beloved local NPR station here in Washington, called On My Mind. And we are all anxious to hear what's on her mind today. So let's bring in Diane Rehm right now.
Hello, Elliot.
Hi, Diane. How are you? Good to be here. So wonderful to have you. So, just a quick side note before we get into substance. We've spoken a bunch of times about this, and I remain mystified every time that you, Diane Rehm, sound exactly like Diane Rehm, which I just the voice comes out.
How else would you expect me to sound?
I don't know. Brassy baritone. I don't know. But I think the fascinating thing, it must be tough to order a pizza or something. I don't know, because people know who you are, right?
Yeah, people do recognize the voice, and I can walk through a grocery store with my husband, with my son, and David, my son, will say, "Uh-oh, there's been a Rehm spotting."
I love it. I love it. I love it. So this is great. So as much as I would love an hour of bonhomie about Diane Rehm and her wonderful, magical voice, let's talk. We are all here to talk about the beautiful film that you are at the center of, called When My Time Comes, which comes to public radio, public television, public television next year. So I've watched it. We'll talk about that, some of my thoughts, and I want to hear your thoughts. Before we begin, why don't we take a look at an excerpt from it, some segments, and then we can talk about it on the backside. So apology again for the technology we're using, folks. I hope I get this right, and then it's clear. Here we go.
What is death? How will my own life end? What options do I have, if any, as to what my death will be like? Artists, philosophers, writers, people like you and me have been considering questions like these for as long as there have been human beings. Today, some of us are willing to speak openly about such things, but many of us are not.
We live in a culture that seems to hide from mortality.
This is the most difficult experience for a patient and their families.
Speaking about death and dying is complicated for people, and it takes a certain amount of willingness to be vulnerable.
These conversations are not actually about dying. They're about the quality of our lives.
Everybody's ideal is to die quickly in their sleep and not have any existential suffering, but that's not available to many of us.
25% of people who die with chronic illness die with uncontrolled pain.
I'm going to die of breast cancer, right? One of the scariest things about that is that you have no control.
but you can't control the
How I
end of
die.
life.
I can control how I die.
Medical aid in dying is a medical treatment that enables a person who is dying, who has exhausted all hope for cure and is close to an imminent death, help them die in comfort, in peace, and with reduced level of suffering.
When somebody is thinking about aid in dying, they're not thinking about it casually.
I think this is a very difficult debate for a lot of people.
Some people don't feel it's an appropriate thing for a doctor to do.
I don't know whether I would use it, but I know I'd like to have the choice.
This is between an individual and her family and doctor.
A good conversation goes a long way.
But this is a hard one.
Most people would rather not talk about death. They'd rather push it out of their minds. But I believe we must talk about it. For me, thinking about what I would like to have at the end of my life is very important. And sharing my wishes with my family, my friends, my physician, I believe will bring comfort to us all when my time comes.
Okay, it's a beautiful film. I have seen it. A couple things. The producer who worked very hard on the film, Joe Fab, I want him to know, if he's watching, that any problems in the transmission are not, that people might have seen on their internet, are not a function of how beautiful the film looks. It's shot in this beautiful soft light. We're streaming it off of a laptop. We're doing our best, and I hope everybody around the country who's watching this today got to see it really clearly and nicely. One big picture point for everybody before, Diane, you and I go back and forth is, we will be taking questions from the audience later on. As things are striking you, by all means, you have a chance to write them down over on the right side of your screen, and then we will tee them up and we can talk about them. So, Diana, a big picture point. I want to talk about sort of the elephant in the webinar, if you want to call it that, which is that we first, you and I and my colleagues and your team sort of started talking about this event back in January when, when COVID-19 was certainly a global concern, but not at epidemic or pandemic proportions, right? And certainly not where we are in the United States today. Now, it's been since brought to my attention by at least one person, and maybe others are thinking it, that having a live stream discussion about medical aid in dying or end of life issues is at a minimum tone deaf and at a maximum distasteful. Now, I know you hold a very strong contrary view on that, and I want to hear from you as to why we should be having this conversation today.
Elliot, I can think of no better time to have this discussion. This is a time when people's lives are being upended. Not only the older people among us, including myself, people all over the country of all ages need to be thinking about what they want at the end of their lives. They need to think before they go into a hospital whether they want to be hooked up to a ventilator, which is not a happy experience and doesn't always have a good outcome. They need to think about whether they want to stay in place if they are sick. They need to think about what it is they want at the end of their lives, because it could be coming in the next 3, 4, 5 days. And they need to communicate that to their families, to their doctors, to the people they love the most, to let them know exactly what it is they want. So forgive me for being contradictory, but in fact, I think it is the time to have this discussion.
And look, rhetorically speaking, the title of the book is when, and the film is When My Time Comes. It presumes that it's coming to all of us. And in fact, I know you often begin talks by saying to people, raise your hands if you're one of those people who's never going to die.
Exactly.
Now, something you've talked about is, there's a cultural aversion to some extent in the United States today about talking about or confronting end-of-life issues. What do you think that's about, really?
Well, it's fascinating to me that in parts of Europe, the discussion is so much more wide open. Here in this country, there seems to be this feeling, certainly among young people, I don't have to think about death. I'm only 45 years old. I've got another at least 30 or 40 years to live. And indeed, the age of death is finally increasing in this country. At the same time, one never knows. There are people in the film and in my book, which, by the way, was taken from the film. The film came first, then I began using some of those transcripts to create the book, which is now out in anticipation of the film. But there are those who were struck by pancreatic cancer in their mid-50s and never thought that such a thing would happen. In fact, one of those people we talked with in California recently died, and she was the picture of health when we saw her almost a year ago. And then just the other day, I received an email from someone related to her saying, if you'd like to know the end of the story, her condition deteriorated rapidly over just a few weeks, but in the end, she was able to carry out her wishes for medical aid in dying. She goes on to say, I know many people who sign up don't go through with it in the end, but I'm glad she was able to die at home in relative comfort. One of those people who also signed up for it was my high school sweetheart. He had prostate cancer that had spread throughout his body. In the end, he decided not to use it and lay quietly, peacefully, and died on his own without the use of medication.
So I want to pick up on your statement of in relative comfort, and then let's talk about you for a second, because there were two deaths that are talked about in the book, in the film and in the book, that seem to shape your approach almost as an evangelist on end-of-life issues, for lack of a better way to put it. One being your mother many, many years ago, and two being your husband just a couple of years ago. So let's first talk about the death of your mother and how that shaped some of the views you hold today with respect to how we talk about and think about the end of our lives.
My mother was only 49 years old. I was 19 when she died. She died suffering in a hospital, begging to die. But of course, she had no opportunity. There were no right to die laws in the country at that time. And when she did finally die, She died in great pain, and I saw that with my own eyes. I got there to the hospital 20 minutes after she died, which broke my heart. My husband, who was in a nursing home in Maryland with severe Parkinson's disease, he could no longer feed himself. He couldn't stand on his own. He couldn't bathe himself. He could do nothing for himself. But he was in Maryland, which then and even now does not have a right to die law. And so what he finally did was to starve himself to death. He stopped eating, he stopped drinking water, he stopped taking medication. Elliot, it took 10 long days for him to die. And it was very, very hard on the family. He was ready. He said, I'm looking forward to the next journey. I want to die. I'm ready to die. And yet, no doctor in Maryland could help him. So you're right. I think I have become something of not really an evangelist, but someone who believes that each of us should have a choice. And if you don't want medical aid in dying, I support you. If you believe that God should be the only decider, I support you. If you want everything medical science can offer, I support you. And if you choose medical aid in dying, I will support you.
That expression, what you just went through there, that's almost the most loving expression of libertarianism I think I've ever heard. Now, I know journalists don't like talking about their personal political beliefs, but would you call yourself a libertarian?
I've never sort of ascribed to that perspective, but I do believe in freedom of choice where dying is concerned, where the end of life is concerned. It should be our own choice.
Great. So let's talk about the film project and sort of, so now we've talked about what got you to the point, and I won't use the word evangelist again, but it's what I noticed is that there's a tremendous amount of care that went into who you spoke to on all sides of this issue. And so by my count, you had doctors who were, for lack of a better term, pro and con. You had people who made the choice to avail themselves ultimately of medical aid in dying, people who were able to lawfully and were inclined to do so, but chose not to, and ultimately passed on or died other ways. Members of the faith community, African-American leaders, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. So just talk about, well, here's a big question. Which interviews stuck with you? Affected you the most of all the dozens of people you spoke to through this project?
Because it was so personal. I think speaking with my own high school sweetheart really affected me so deeply. Seeing that young, vital man with whom I went to the high school prom, with whom I graduated and kept in touch with for all these years, seeing him in such strong, good humor toward the end of his life, seeing his loving wife, Irene, standing next to him, supporting him in his choices, whatever they were. I found that so incredibly moving. He kept his sense of humor, which he had always had, right to the end. There are so many wonderful individuals who shared their lives with us during the filming of this project. And I must say, I give Joe Fab, the director of this film, credit, and Diane Naughton, the producer, who found these wonderful people to whom we could speak.
What I was also struck by is, another person, so I teed this up a little bit earlier, but another person who gave their life to this was you. And, the scene that stuck with me the most is you and your grandson talking about your own plans for the end of life, some of which don't specifically refer to medical aid in dying, but what you want as you reach your final days. And that was intensely personal. I think very few of us have had that kind of conversation with our own grandparents. And so what was that like?
It was extraordinary, but I assure you, I asked his mother before I carried on that conversation. And Ben was at the time 18 years old, about to be a freshman at Dartmouth, and a mature 18-year-old. And I told him that I wanted him to record that conversation on his cell phone. I then talked to him while he was recording, and the cameraman was recording the two of us. So it does appear in the film. I told him that should I begin to experience Alzheimer's disease, I needed to have feedback from him and the rest of the family, because I did not wish to go to the end of my life with Alzheimer's. And that, as you correctly point out, is not allowed under any medical aid in dying law around the country. The only thing that is allowed is if someone is deemed within 6 months of death. But I'm jumping ahead because I fear a stroke. I fear a heart attack, which keeps me partially alive. And I fear Alzheimer's. And therefore, I wanted him to know that and to share that with the rest of our family.
Excellent. So a point that you make is that you were, and you use the words favorably inclined to support medical aid in dying prior to the experience with your husband, but something about that experience and his passing led to almost a bit of an evolution in you. And there's a Maryland state delegate or state senator who makes the point, we are all one bad death away from supporting medical aid in dying. His words, not mine, but it's a powerful sentiment. So talk through that. Do you think it's these personal experiences that lead to people's support of around this issue?
Well, it is personal experience. It is also one's own faith belief. It is also some doctors who, as you heard from Dr. Catalin Roth, some doctors do not believe that they should be involved in helping patients die. So even in states where it's allowed, you must be very careful to search out a physician who will help you. They're not all willing. So, it is personal choice. Someone raised as a Roman Catholic would view this as being suicide, not medical aid in dying, and would therefore perhaps be very opposed to that choice. So that's why I believe everyone's choice and everyone's belief should be honored. However, I do believe that state legislatures have an obligation to hear this point of view, that choice should determine what we as individuals do with our lives at the end of our life. I don't think it should be in the hands of a politician to determine whether and when I can die.
And in fact, there's one person's quoted in the film who's saying, it's a doctor actually, who makes the point that the idea, and this stuck with me as a former prosecutor, the idea of justice or injustice is the idea of one person being entitled to something that not all people are equally entitled to, assuming we regard it as a right. But let me ask you, neither you, as I just said, neither you nor I are physicians. I believe your daughter is a physician, but there's almost a philosophical question as to what is the role of doctors, not even in medical aid in dying, but of doctors generally? And that's almost a thread through the film, which is that, is it the point of doctors only to minimize suffering? Is it the point of doctors to try to make you better at all costs? And how does that question, which you sort of grapple with in the film, affect how people feel about medical aid in dying, even physicians feel about medical aid in dying?
I believe the role of a doctor is to listen very, very carefully to what it is that patient is saying, what it is that patient is asking for, whether that patient wants one more treatment, whether that patient wants one more new drug, whether that patient wants to continue to go on, and listening. If that doctor is listening carefully, he or she can't help but understand the passion beneath those feelings, whether they be, doctor, please do everything you can for me, or doctor, my faith says I'm here until God takes me, or please, doctor, I've had enough. I cannot go through anymore. I'm ready to die. Please hear me.
Sorry, I muted myself. The one sort of last thing I want to ask you about before we bring Kim into the conversation. Something that struck me, and if you, it's sort of as you see the logo in the corner, my firm, my colleagues, the Rehm Group, we're a majority minority firm. We talk and think about matters as they affect across different groups in society. And something that the film takes on and is quite honest about is race and the manner in which there are disconnects and disagreements between, sort of how the African American community seems to regard medical aid in dying differently, in fact, there's one African American, I believe it was pastor, who says that he would support it if he felt that he had any faith that the medical community would actually treat Black people fairly. So, what did you see and learn? I know you've interviewed Black people throughout your career, but what struck you about this aspect of the discussion as you were having it?
That he was right on. He said, African Americans in my congregation will never forget the Tuskegee experiments. They will never forget that the care for Black Americans in this country is less than it is for white Americans. The healthcare system is out of whack. We've already learned that the coronavirus is affecting so many more African Americans than it is white Americans. It is said because there may be underlying kidney disease, there may be underlying problems of other sorts. Nevertheless, they do not trust doctors and the law to make decisions in their favor.
So thank you for that. So, so before we bring in Kim Kalman from Compassion and Choices, just a note to everyone who's watching today. Obviously, this film will be coming to public television next year. You can learn more about it and, frankly, make a tax-deductible donation to the project. And we're flashing it on the screen now, www.whenmytimecomes.com. It's I feel, it's rare that I get to see something before everybody else does. So that was kind of cool. It is such a beautiful, such an honest, such an even-handed work, personalized by so many people, and the level of care and respect with which you and the team that put it together gave to everybody, even people that clearly do not hold your view, Diane. It was just remarkable. And so I urge everyone to pay attention and as we get closer to the film. Okay, so with that, we will bring in Kim Kalman, who is president and CEO of Compassion and Choices, an organization specifically focused on end-of-life issues, and of course talks a great deal about medical aid and dying. Now, Kim, you had a cameo in the film, which was kind of cool, testifying in the Maryland state legislature. First, before talking about you and your work, what about the project or the film particularly struck you or stayed with you?
Well, first of all, we're really thankful for Diane for taking on this issue. Obviously, her with her notoriety and her eloquence in her speech, we're grateful that she's at the forefront, bringing her strong voice to the issue. Both the book and the movie, I think, are beautifully done. What struck me about the book is that it includes both proponents and opponents, and of course, I support the issue fervently. But one of the things that's so important in our country is that we're really hearing and listening to each other, other perspectives. And for me, it was a unique moment when I could sit down and really just try to understand the other side. And that, I think, is something that's unique. There's been a lot of books that have been done on this topic or this issue, but to have unedited conversations with the opponents and to really understand where they're coming from, I was really grateful for that. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's there are issues on which reasonable minds can disagree, of course, so many of these issues. But you're talking about, as Diane and I have talked about, matters of race, matters of religion, matters of personal politics, and again, all of these things are so deeply entrenched in, and it's wonderful to show that level of respect to all sides, to all points of view. So let's talk about you and your work for a moment, Kim. A lot of people don't know about Compassion and Choices, so let's talk about sort of what the organization is, why it exists, and what exactly you do.
So Compassion and Choices has been around for several decades now, and our mission is really about having as many people as possible be able to have the kind of end-of-life experience that they want. So if you think about the situation of Diane with her husband, it's about helping to have more people be fully empowered to have the kind of end-of-life experience that they are seeking out.
Great. And then more importantly, it's, we'd be remiss if not asking everybody how they're doing with COVID-19 and how sort of what your work, how's it evolved and how's it changed over the course of this last 3 months.
Yeah. So COVID-19 obviously is a moment when society has all of a sudden become much more attuned with their own mortality. And so as Diane said in the beginning of the conversation, this is a time when our mission has elevated in importance. We have a COVID-19 toolkit that's out there that helps people be able to make decisions like, do I want a ventilator? Do I want to go to the hospital? Do I want to get resuscitated? Those are questions that people can only answer for themselves if they've really stopped and thought about it and if they understand it. If they understand the likelihood that they're going to survive if they are resuscitated or they choose ventilation. So we have a toolkit that helps walk people through those kinds of issues.
And it's wonderful. I've got to tell you, I've seen this and it truly is helpful to all of us.
And just a reminder, we flashed it on the screen a moment ago. We can flash it again too, just so that folks see. If they wish to take a look at that resource, by all means, they can at Compassion and Choices' website. So back to the film for a second, which obviously, again, came out of Cameo. Diane had her Cecil B. DeMille star moment. Well, you've had many of those, but you know what I mean. So one of the key focuses is on a state in which medical aid in dying law did not pass, ultimately. And to some extent, that allowed a real exploration of the various issues, because you could really see opposition, because the opposition worked. At least you couldn't get it through the Maryland state legislature. So let's talk first about Maryland, because I just teed it up. But then if you could give us a lay of the national land today as to where things stand on the issue and what kind of work you're doing there.
Sure. And before I go specifically into Maryland, I'd love to just say a couple of words about the movie, because I do think it is so nicely done that I want people to take the time to go to the website, check it out, and support Diane in the book, because it will make a big difference if you're supportive of this movement. But what is wonderful about the movie, so many things, but it starts with Diane telling her own personal story. So you get to experience the issue as a patient. And then it kind of evolves and moves you through lots of different people's experience, both the supporters and opponents. And those conversations, they're both beautifully done, but it allows you to look at the issue from a lot of different perspectives. So for somebody who's not yet sure what they think about the issue, it would be a great way to explore it. Do you want me to go into Maryland?
Sure, yeah.
So Maryland last year and coming into this year, unfortunately with COVID-19, we didn't get to finish this legislative session, but there was a lot of opposition, and the opposition came from the disability community. It came from the Catholic Church. Those were really the two biggest opponents. But what the opposition in Maryland did that was different than what we've seen in other communities is we had the support to be able to advance the issue. And so they started to try to add in regulatory requirements that were very burdensome, that on the face of it sounded reasonable, but we know from the experience of a patient trying to navigate the process was simply going to result in them hitting roadblocks. And if you can imagine a patient's experience, they're at the end of their life, they're dying, their time is precious. There's a moment in the movie where Brittany Menard's husband, Dan, says, "We felt robbed of time because we had to move from California to Oregon." Well, that's how patients feel when they're at the end of their life and they're going through this process, and the process never ends. And what the Maryland legislature did was the opposition added about 40 requirements, and something like 17 of them were actually introduced into the legislation. And ultimately, we pulled our support from that version of the bill, because at the end of the day, if no patient can get through the process, that's worse than not having the law at all.
So I don't want us to degenerate today into a point-counterpoint
Sure.
about picking apart other people, but I'd love, because I think a lot of people who may not follow this closely may not understand why. And let me just throw out three. Number one, the disability community. Number two, obviously, churches in the Catholic Church. And number three, African Americans, right? What is at the heart of the various oppositions they might have, and what is your response to the extent you have one?
Sure. So if you start with the disability community, they have really real concerns about the fact that they are often devalued within society and from the medical community. So they are concerned that this law devalues them, because it often people who are choosing the option will cite different things that seem like they're similar to somebody who has a disability as reasons that they want to use the law. The difference, though, is that a person who's choosing medical aid in dying is terminally ill, and they're already going to die. They have a prognosis of 6 months or less to live. The legislation actually says disability alone is not a reason for somebody cannot be eligible just because they have a disability. And so there's never been a single incidence of abuse or coercion, which is part of what the disability community is concerned about, that somebody is going to use it against them. And the person has to be mentally capable. They have to be able to make the decision themselves in the moment and able to self-ingest. Those are key safeguards. So given all the safeguards, the fact that it's been around for a combined 40 years, we know that it is safe and that people will be able to access the law, but that nobody is going to be coerced into choosing this option who doesn't want it.
And Jim, you should add, I think that of those who do receive the medication, only 2/3 actually use it. So that choice is there right up to the end. Nobody is pushing anybody.
So we can almost, let me just go right to the African American community, Kim, because I think that, it sort of makes sense. This is why doctors might have concerns with medical aid in dying. This is why churches might. But again, it may not be intuitive to everybody as to why there's sort of a racial divide, for lack of a better term, on this issue. And I'd love to hear what you have to say about how you work around that.
Sure. And so I should say, with the disability community, with the African American community, and with the Catholic community, with all three of those communities, the individuals themselves, when you poll them, are supportive, majority support. It's the leadership within each of those communities that is oppositional. So when you look specifically at the African American community, I think there's two different aspects that are play. One is faith, that there are members of the African American community, faith leaders in particular, not all though, but some faith leaders who feel like it's opposed to their faith. And the second points to issues like you mentioned earlier with the Tuskegee trials, and there being a systematic devaluing of African Americans' lives. And those are really real concerns that I would not want to in any way minimize. But what we have seen over and over again is more and more African American leaders embracing this as an option. Elijah Cummings, before he died, came out in favor of it. We just had Dr. Ben Chavis. So there's more and more African American leaders who are supportive of this option. And they recognize that there are enough safeguards in place in order to protect communities like the African American community, because the person is mentally capable, and that ultimately all communities, all people really do want to have options and choice at the end of their life. So we're seeing a shift even within the African American community.
Two more questions I have for you before we open it up to the world for them to have their chance to ask Diane Rehm questions, and turnabout is fair play, Diane. But I'd be really curious about, just sort of broadly speaking, the nationwide. So obviously the effort did not pass in Maryland. Which states do have, or jurisdictions, to the extent you can rattle them off, do have that option available? Which ones are close? And just whatever you can say about that.
So there are 9 states and Washington, D.C. that have the option. It's Oregon, Washington, Vermont, Montana, Colorado, Washington, D.C., Hawaii, New Jersey, Maine. Did I say Vermont?
I believe so.
So those are the sort of 9 jurisdictions in Washington, D.C. We had legislation active in about 24 states last year. And you've got a whole host of them. It'll be interesting to see what happens after the legislative sessions, or after the elections this year, to see kind of which ones are in play. But I would say there are about 6 to 10 states that have a good possibility of really realizing this option within the next 3 years.
And I guess my last question for you before we open it up is, where now, sort of where do we go from here with the issue, broadly speaking, and what are you thinking about?
So I think there's a couple of different things that are important as a part of the movement. There's realizing this option for everybody in every single state. There's the fact that we have enough evidence and data out there to demonstrate that among those people who are eligible, mentally capable, terminally ill, prognosis of 6 months or less to live, that too many of them are hitting regulatory roadblocks and aren't able to make it through the process. And that's a pretty devastating experience. So there's figuring out, are there ways to tweak the law? Oregon just passed legislation last session where they dropped the 15-day waiting period. So simple ways to tweak the law, not to change the eligibility criteria, but to tweak the law so that more people are able to access the law who are eligible. And then the third thing, separate from medical aid in dying, but we have efforts underway to help people who have dementia be able to realize a more compassionate end using existing laws around people's right to forego treatments. And we have tools that are available to people on our website around that.
Okay, excellent. So we have an active audience right now that has a lot of thoughts or a lot of questions. And so can we pull one of them up on the screen and then see what folks have to say?
Sure.
Okay, so Adrian Reese writes into us, I have a DNR and have had physicians tell me that they will ignore it. What's the best way to ensure that directives are followed?
I think it depends on where Adrian lives and whether, in fact, if her doctor is not going to follow her own DNR, she needs to find a new doctor. That would be, that's what I did, because I found out my own physician did not feel comfortable with medical aid in dying. She's a young woman. I asked her. She said, I'm not comfortable. So I found a new doctor.
Okay, Kim?
Oh, I think what Diane is doing is really showing what more people need to be doing as a consumer advocate, which is lining up healthcare providers that are going to give you the care that you want. And in terms of a DNR, most doctors and health systems will respect that. If you have it on you, if you have a healthcare proxy that's with you advocating for you. And I would also recommend that people, if they really don't want, they want less care at the end of life, you should look to avoid Catholic hospitals, which have to follow ethical and religious directives, tend to value life over quality of life.
Okay, well, thank you, Adrian, sorry if I got it wrong, for that question. Melissa Widener asks, do you have any suggestions on how to help people understand I'm not being morbid in talking about my death? I'm 36 and have many health issues and have a fear of being kept alive against my wishes. This gets back to your very first point, Diane, about morbidity inherent to the discussion or not. So let's hear what you think there.
I think you need to make your wishes very clear to your doctors, to your next of kin. They may be uncomfortable talking about it, but that doesn't prevent you from talking about your wishes, putting them in writing. Do as I did, have someone make a video of you on a cell phone so that that video is available to anyone and everyone, so they understand you're not being morbid, you're simply putting forth your wishes.
Great. Kim, anything else to add on that? Or
Sure. Well, when I had the conversation with my daughter, what I said to her was, it will really help me be able to live my life to the fullest, knowing that we're clear about what it is that I want at the very end. So sometimes if you approach the conversation as one that's about life and not about death, that makes it feel a little bit less morbid.
And I will be perfectly candid. My wife lost her mother maybe about 10 or 15 years ago and just has a different relationship to talking about death than I do. And I think because she's had to confront it, and I had to confront it almost, this is as your point was, Diane, you don't know. It could happen, she was surprised by the death and you just don't know when it's coming. And it's very important for all of us to just think of these things that, will be a reality for all of us.
Elliot, in the midst of this coronavirus, I sent a whole list of contacts to each of my children to have, should I suddenly become ill. And my daughter, the doctor, who also has a great sense of humor, sent back an email saying, Mom, are you going somewhere? So it can be dealt with humorously but she took me very, very seriously.
Great. Okay. Next question. Can we pull it up? Hello, Diane. I also have Parkinson's. I will likely not, this is from Jennifer B. Hello, Jennifer. I will likely not be able to take advantage of medical aid in dying. Will you please share any advice on living and dying with Parkinson's from your experience with your husband?
Jennifer, I'm so sorry you have Parkinson's. It's a very, very difficult disease to live and die with. And I can only say to you that the only thing that John Rehm had open to him was VSED, and that is the end of taking in food, water, medication. For some people, it can take as long as it did for him, 10 days. For other people, it happens much more quickly. But you can be kept comfortable during that period should you decide that that is how you want to go. And should you decide that you can no longer live with Parkinson's. And what is on the death certificate of my husband is he died of Parkinson's disease.
Wow. Okay. Well, thank you, Jennifer, for that question and for your honesty and speaking to us today. Can we have another question? Hannah Risley, or Risley, I apologize if I mispronounced you, asks, are there any possible options for medical aid in dying for patients with memory issues? My grandmother passed after a prolonged struggle with Lewy body dementia, and I do not want that for myself.
Well, it is in that same category, isn't it, Kim?
Yeah, and so there is not an option for medical aid in dying for people with dementia, but there is an option that would allow you to still to accelerate the length of time that you live in a state of dementia. So Hannah, right now, I'd encourage you to go to the Compassion and Choices website and find our Dementia Values and Priorities tool. And what that Values and Priorities tool does is it lets you walk through the point at which you would want to forego treatments that would allow you to have a more compassionate end. And you can shorten the length of time that you live with dementia for years. So for someone who knows now that that's not what you want, I would really encourage you to do that. We also have, if you go to our webinar series, we actually have a webinar tomorrow around the issue of dementia. So you could also join that and learn more.
You know, Kim, I found that so helpful. I went through it myself because it forced me to focus on exactly how far I was willing to go and to think very hard and very carefully about those issues. So I congratulate you for putting that up.
Thank you. And it will be so helpful for Ben because it takes away that angst that your caregiver has about, well, is this the moment that the person would want? And, you know, they're carrying out your wishes, but if they don't have clear direction, it's hard to know. It's not like with dementia, there's like, you flip a switch and all of a sudden it's a gradual thing. And there's lots of points along that way and people treat them all differently.
Okay, let's take one more question from the audience. This is from Jay LaRue or LaRoe. That's the second one. I feel like I haven't done great with people's names, but from any thoughts on the recent Johns Hopkins study, which used psilocybin to ease end-of-life anxiety in subjects with terminal illness?
I don't know about that drug.
I don't either.
Me neither. I'm sorry. I'm not a doctor, so I can't speak specifically to the drug.
Fair enough. One more. This question is for Kim. How can we work to have legislation passed in Florida? This is a fairly conservative state and doesn't seem likely to be very friendly on the issue.
Yeah, so we actually do have efforts underway in Florida. They had legislation for the first time this year. You're correct that Florida is a more conservative state in this regard, and that it will take longer in a state like Florida. But I think every time we advance legislation in one state, it benefits another state. Eventually, we will have enough of a political will to be able to move it everywhere. So we just have to keep moving along and think about it not just as your state, but as a national movement. And eventually, we'll be able to move forward everywhere. But we do have efforts in Florida that are focused on improving the health systems. And that's the kind of approach we're taking in a state like Florida.
And I'd be remiss if I did not mention that my husband, whom I married in 2016, lives in Florida, has been very active with Compassion and Choices and trying to move that legislation forward.
This is Elliot in Washington with a question. And I'd love to hear both of you from your various perspectives address this question of suicide. Because I noticed, Diane, I was struck by the fact that your husband's death certificate didn't say, taking his own life or whatever. And so from both of your perspectives, why, and you've both, neither of you have used the words euthanasia or suicide, which obviously many people use when talking about medical aid in dying. Just explore that with us for a quick second as our final thought.
The first person I talked with in the book and in the film, Lori is her name. She was 37 when she first contracted breast cancer, which then spread throughout her body. She said, if I had my druthers, I would live to be 90. She said, I don't have that choice. There is no choice for me. I know I am dying. What I insist on doing is dying peacefully, the way I choose to die. And in California, where she was, she had that choice. None of these sick people has chosen to die as one would if one perhaps simply decided to end his or her own life, which I regard as suicide. These are people who are sick, who are dying, who see the end of life near. That's very different from suicide.
Yeah.
Kim?
Yeah, Diane has it absolutely right. I'll just add that I unfortunately went through a suicide with a family member myself. And the experience on a family member when somebody commits suicide is very different than the experience that a family has when somebody is going through medical aid and dying. Medical aid and dying is empowering. The person is going to die and they are choosing how they die, how much they suffer. Whereas with suicide itself, the person isn't going to die, and all of a sudden, and they have a mental disease and they take their life. It's not rational. One is very rational, the other one is irrational. So it's so different.
Okay, final word here from Diane Rehm. You have the floor before we wrap up. Any final thoughts?
My final thought is that I hope that this conversation that we have had here today will spur others to have that conversation within their own families, because that's where it begins. Share your feelings about what it is you want at the end of life. Share them with your family members. Share them with your doctors, share them with your friends, and make sure people understand that you're not doing this because you're depressed or sad or miserable. You're doing this because you want control at the end of your own life.
Well, thank you very much for that, and for your passion and honesty and care and love in this project, which, again, when the world sees it next year sometime, I think they'll get to experience it too. Again, people can learn more and make a tax-deductible donation at www.whenmytimemovie. When my time comes, the producer's going to kill me for that, but whenmytimecomes.movie.com. So thank you so much, Diane Rehm. Thank you, Kim Callahan, for being here and sharing your views on all of this. That is all for today. For more information on us, you can come to www.ravengroup.com. And again, through this period of social distancing, we will be doing more programming, not as interesting and fascinating as this with Diane Rehm, but well, actually, no, everything's fascinating, but Diane Rehm, come on. So we will be putting on plenty during this difficult time. Get the book. It is a beautiful, honest take. I have it here. I've been through it. I've seen the movie. So again, thank you everyone for tuning in. And again, stay safe in this difficult time. Take care.
Thank you, Elliot.
Thanks.